Welcome to the sovereign archive of the audiobook empire. You are about to enter a critical immersion into the mechanics of human influence. This is not about the art of persuasion. It is about the science of what happens before persuasion even begins. Most people spend their lives perfecting what they say, but they remain ignored because they ignore the environment in which their message is received. Robert Cialdini's Pre-Suasion is the master key to the privileged moment, the hidden window of time where a mind is made ready for a message. In the high-stakes landscape of 2026, where every second is a battlefield for attention, those who do not master the persuasive strike are destined to fail. This script is designed to recode your understanding of how choices are made. We are going to strip away the illusions of free will and reveal the psychological architecture that directs human behavior from the shadows. You will learn that the highest form of influence is not a loud argument, but a quiet preparation of the field. By the end of this journey, you will no longer be a participant in the social grid. You will be its architect. We will deconstruct the biological triggers and the environmental anchors that make a person say yes before you even ask the question. This is the 1% margin. This is the sovereign OS. This is the total mastery of the privileged moment. Prepare your mind for a deep descent into the persuasive frame. The architecture of influence begins with the concept of the privileged moment, a temporary window where a target is uniquely receptive to a specific suggestion. To understand this, one must realize that human attention is not a steady stream, but a spotlight that can be directed. When we focus on a single concept, the mind automatically elevates the importance of that concept, a phenomenon known as channeled attention. This is the engine of persuasion. If you can control what a person is thinking about in the moments before you present your idea, you have already won. This is not about changing long-term beliefs. It is about managing the immediate psychological state.
For example, by asking a person if they consider themselves to be helpful, you are not merely gathering data. You are forcing their neural circuitry to scan for instances of helpfulness. Once they confirm this identity to themselves, they are neurologically primed to agree to a subsequent request for help to maintain consistency. This is a clinical application of identity priming. The persuader does not wait for the right moment. They create it through the strategic use of anchors and frames. Whether it is using high numbers to make a price seem small or using specific background imagery to trigger feelings of comfort or urgency, the environment dictates the decision. In the 2026 digital grid, attention is the ultimate currency. If you cannot capture and channel it, your message is white noise. To be a master of persuasion is to understand that the human mind is highly associative. Every word, every color, and every sound carries a hidden baggage of associations that can be weaponized to tilt the scales of judgment. We move beyond the surface-level tactics of sales and into the deep structure mechanics of brain state management. This process requires a detached, strategic mindset. You are not talking to someone, you are operating on their cognitive framework. By shifting the initial focus, you create a path of least resistance that leads directly to your desired outcome. This immersion will provide the tactical blueprints for every stage of this process, ensuring your influence is absolute. The strategic persuader understands that language is not just a tool for communication, but a mechanism for neural triggering. Every word we use carries an invisible web of associations that can either open or close the mind of the receiver. To master the privileged moment, one must become an architect of these associations, choosing words that align the target's internal state with the desired external outcome. This involves the use of metaphors, which are the most potent tools in the persuasive arsenal. A metaphor does not just describe a situation, it frames it in a way that dictates how the brain processes information. If you describe a problem as a virus, the mind instinctively begins to look for a cure and a strategy for containment. If you describe the same problem as a monster, the mind looks for a hero and a weapon. The pre-suasive strike involves selecting the metaphor that naturally leads to your proposed solution before the solution is even mentioned. This is the science of associative coherence. When the brain encounters a concept, it immediately activates related concepts in its neural network. By preloading the mind with specific metaphors related to growth, stability, or speed, you ensure that the subsequent message is interpreted through that specific lens. This level of influence requires a clinical understanding of the cultural and psychological baggage that words carry in the 2026 digital grid. You are not looking for the most accurate word, but the most effective trigger. This also extends to the physical and digital environment where the interaction occurs. The background images on a website, the ambient noise in a room, or even the weight of a clipboard can act as pre-suasive anchors. Studies have shown that people who are holding a warm drink are more likely to perceive a stranger as having a warm personality. Those who are sitting in a comfortable, soft chair are less likely to be rigid in a negotiation. These environmental cues are the silent partners of the pre-suasive process. They work because they bypass the analytical mind entirely, reaching directly for the primitive, associative brain. As a sovereign strategist, you must audit every element of the environment to ensure it is projecting the correct frequency. If your goal is to command authority, every visual and auditory cue must signal high status and clinical precision. If your goal is to build rapport, the environment must signal safety and shared identity. This is not manipulation in the traditional sense, it is the optimization of the psychological field. You are simply removing the friction that prevents a person from seeing the value in what you are offering. By the time you reach the point of making a request, the target should feel as though the decision has already been made within their own mind. They are merely catching up to the reality you have already constructed. This requires a patient, detached approach. You must resist the urge to rush into the persuasion phase. The more time you spend in the persuasion phase, building the associative framework and securing the privileged moment, the less effort you will need to exert when it is time to close the deal. The master persuader moves slowly and deliberately, knowing that the battle is won in the preparation, not the execution. We will now examine the specific triggers of identity and how to leverage the power of the sixth principle to create a sense of unity that makes resistance psychologically impossible for the target. The ultimate frontier of persuasion is the principle of unity, a psychological force that goes beyond mere liking or similarity to a state of shared identity. When we perceive someone as being one of us, the normal barriers of social resistance dissolve, and their influence over our decisions becomes near total. To activate this in the privileged moment, the strategist must use triggers that signal a deep collective belonging. This is what Robert Cialdini calls we-ness. It is the feeling that the influencer and the influenced share a common essence, whether through family ties, geographic location, or shared mission. In the 2026 digital ecosystem where people are increasingly tribal, the ability to frame a proposal within the context of a shared identity is the most powerful move you can make. This begins with the language of togetherness. Using words like we, us, and our is not just a stylistic choice, it is a tactical deployment of the unity principle. These words act as neural keys that unlock the target's tribal defenses. Before you present your core message, you must first establish this shared ground. This can be done by highlighting a common enemy, a shared struggle, or a collective vision of the future. By doing so, you are not just an outsider trying to persuade, you are a member of the same tribe providing a solution for the benefit of the whole. This psychological alignment makes the subsequent message feel like an internal thought rather than an external suggestion. The power of unity is most visible in the context of co-creation. When you involve the person in the process of building an idea or a product, they develop a sense of ownership over it. This is a persuasive masterstroke. By asking for advice instead of feedback, you invite the target into your inner circle. Advice implies a shared journey and a collaborative effort, whereas feedback creates a distance between the creator and the critic. The moment a person provides advice, they become psychologically invested in the success of the project. They are no longer judging your idea, they are defending their own. This is the essence of building a sovereign brand in the audiobook empire. You do not just deliver content to an audience, you build a tribe that feels a sense of unity with your mission. This sense of belonging is a persuasive anchor that ensures long-term loyalty and absolute influence. Furthermore, the persuader can leverage the concept of acting together. Engaging in synchronized activities such as repetitive movements, shared rituals, or even simultaneous digital interactions creates a biological sense of unity that bypasses rational thought. This is why rallies, marches, and group exercises are so effective at building collective resolve. In a digital environment, this can be replicated through live interactions and synchronized events that make the audience feel like they are part of a singular moving force. Once this state of synchronization is achieved, any directive given by the leader is met with high compliance because the individual's identity has been merged with the group. You must strategically use these privileged moments of unity to solidify your authority and ensure that your message is received not with skepticism, but with the total acceptance reserved for a trusted ally. By mastering the triggers of shared identity, you move beyond the mechanics of persuasion and into the realm of absolute psychological integration, where your will becomes the will of the tribe. Beyond the mechanics of unity, the persuasive strategist must master the deployment of reciprocity as an environmental trigger rather than a mere exchange. In the standard model of persuasion, reciprocity is a transaction. In the persuasive model, it is a psychological atmosphere created before the request is even conceptualized. To implement this, you must provide value that is unexpected, significant, and personalized. When a person receives a gift or a piece of high-value information that they did not ask for, a state of psychological debt is instantly triggered. This debt creates a privileged moment characterized by a heightened desire to balance the scales. The master persuader uses this window to present their primary message, knowing that the target's natural resistance is lowered by the internal pressure to reciprocate. This is not about the value of the gift itself, but about the social obligation it generates. In the 2026 digital grid, this looks like the distribution of exclusive, high-density insights that solve a specific problem for the audience before asking for their time or capital. By solving their problems for free, you are pre-framing yourself as a benefactor rather than a salesman. This shifts the power dynamic in your favor. Parallel to this is the persuasive use of authority. Most influencers try to establish authority during their pitch. The master establishes it before they enter the room. This is achieved through the strategic display of credentials, the association with high-status entities, and the use of clinical, precise language in all preliminary communications. When you are perceived as an authority figure before you speak, your words are not evaluated for their logic. They are accepted as directives. This is the halo effect in a persuasive context. You are using the privileged moment of first contact to install a hierarchy. This hierarchy ensures that when the core message is delivered, it is received by a mind that is already in a state of compliance. Furthermore, we must consider the persuasive application of social proof. Instead of telling someone that your idea is popular, you ensure they encounter evidence of its popularity before they ever see the idea itself. This is environmental priming. By surrounding the target with subtle cues that others are already moving in a certain direction, you create a sense of inevitability. The mind instinctively seeks the safety of the herd. By the time you present your proposal, the target should feel that they are not making a new choice, but joining an existing successful movement. This reduces the perceived risk and increases the speed of adoption.
We also examine the power of persuasive scarcity by hinting at the limited nature of an opportunity or the exclusivity of a certain circle before the details are revealed. You trigger the fear of loss. This loss aversion is a primitive drive that shuts down analytical thinking. The mind becomes obsessed with securing the opportunity, making it highly receptive to whatever instructions follow. Every one of these principles, reciprocity, authority, social proof, and scarcity, must be woven into the pre-persuasion phase to ensure that the actual persuasion is merely a formality. You are essentially sculpting the psychological landscape to ensure that the only logical path for the target is the one you have designed. This is the clinical reality of the sovereign OS. The mechanics of directed attention are further intensified by the focus is importance effect, a cognitive bias where the human brain automatically assigns high value to whatever is currently occupying its conscious workspace. To be a master persuader, you must learn to manipulate this spotlight of attention with surgical precision. One of the most effective ways to hold this spotlight is through the strategic use of mystery. When a person encounters a puzzle, a gap in information, or an unfinished narrative, their brain enters a state of heightened arousal and cognitive tension. This is known as the Zeigarnik effect, which states that people remember uncompleted or interrupted tasks better than completed ones. In a persuasive context, you can use mystery to lock a target's attention onto your presence long before you reveal your true objective. By presenting a compelling problem or a counterintuitive fact without an immediate explanation, you create a psychological itch that the target can only scratch by continuing to pay attention to you. This sustained attention is a privileged moment in itself. While the target is busy trying to solve the mystery you have presented, their defensive barriers are lowered because they're in a state of active seeking rather than passive resistance. This is the ultimate setup for a persuasive message. You are not just asking for their attention, you are making it impossible for them to look away. Furthermore, we must consider the role of task shifting and interruptions. When you interrupt a person's current train of thought with a novel and salient stimulus, you create a brief moment of disorientation. In this vacuum of certainty, the mind becomes highly suggestible as it looks for the next piece of information to ground itself. This is why the timing of a persuasive strike is just as important as the content. You want to hit the target at the precise moment their attention is fluid. This involves a deep understanding of cognitive load. If a person is overwhelmed with information, they will shut down. However, if you provide a singular, focused point of high-interest mystery, you can channel their entire cognitive capacity toward your goal. This also relates to the concept of the evaluative frame. When we are forced to focus on one thing, we naturally ignore everything else. This is not just a lack of attention to other things, it is an active suppression of competing information. The persuader ensures that the target's mental environment is cleared of any distractions that could provide a counter-argument to the coming message. You are effectively isolating the target in a psychological vacuum where only your signal exists. By the time you provide the resolution to the mystery, the resolution itself carries the weight of authority and truth simply because it provided the much-needed cognitive closure. This process of creating tension and then providing the specific relief you have designed is the core of high-level strategic communication. In the 2026 digital grid, where every creator is fighting for a split second of focus, using mystery as a persuasive engine allows you to dominate the neural landscape of your audience. You are moving from a position of trying to be noticed to a position of being impossible to ignore. This is how you build the sovereign OS within the minds of your followers, making your channel the primary source of signal in a world of infinite noise. The geography of influence is not just about where you are, but what the environment signals about who you should be in that moment. Every visual cue in a room or on a digital interface acts as a silent instructor to the brain, priming specific neural pathways before a single word is exchanged. This is environmental persuasion. Research has shown that even subtle changes in background imagery can fundamentally alter a person's priorities and decision-making criteria. For instance, when people are shown images of clouds or soft surfaces before viewing furniture options, they prioritize comfort and price becomes a secondary concern. Conversely, when they are primed with images of coins or currency, they become hypersensitive to cost. This suggests that the mind is not a fixed entity, but a fluid state that takes its cues from the immediate surroundings. To be a sovereign architect of influence, you must curate every pixel and every physical object within the field of view. This is about creating a cognitive landscape where your desired outcome is the only logical choice. In the 2026 digital grid, this means that the aesthetic of your content is not just a matter of branding, but a strategic deployment of psychological triggers. The colors, fonts, and layout you choose are persuasive engines that determine the emotional frequency of your audience. If you want to prime for authority, you use deep, saturated tones and minimalist, high-contrast typography. If you want to prime for openness and creativity, you use expansive, bright layouts with organic shapes. These elements work because they operate on the level of cognitive ease. When the environment feels familiar or aligned with a person's internal goals, their mental friction decreases, making them more receptive to new ideas. This environment also influences self-persuasion, which is the most powerful form of influence. By placing certain objects or messages in a person's environment, you can lead them to believe that the thoughts they are having are their own, rather than a result of your external priming. This is the invisible hand of persuasion. You are not pushing information into their minds, you are pulling their minds into a state where your information is already welcome. This also applies to the internal geography of the mind, the memories and identities that a person carries with them. By triggering a specific memory or an aspect of a person's identity, you can shift their entire evaluative frame. If you remind someone of their role as a leader, they will evaluate your proposal through the lens of authority and responsibility. If you remind them of their role as a provider, they will focus on security and long-term value. The master persuader knows how to toggle these identities through the use of subtle linguistic and environmental anchors. This allows you to speak to the specific version of the person that is most likely to agree with you. This level of precision requires a deep understanding of the target's psychological profile and the cultural codes they operate within. You are effectively mapping the territory before you begin the journey, ensuring that every step you take is on ground that you have already prepared. The strategic deployment of associative links is what transforms a simple message into a neural command. Every concept in the human mind is connected to a vast web of other concepts, and the persuader's task is to activate the specific nodes in that web that will facilitate agreement. This is known as semantic priming. When you use a specific word, you are not just conveying a definition, you are triggering a cascade of related thoughts and emotions. For example, using the word investment instead of cost or expense immediately shifts the brain's evaluative frame from one of loss to one of future gain. This is a subtle but profound shift that happens in the privileged moment before the numbers are even discussed. To master this, you must develop a clinical vocabulary where every term is chosen for its associative baggage. In the 2026 digital grid, where linguistic patterns are analyzed by algorithms and human minds alike, your choice of synonyms can determine the success or failure of your influence. This associative power also applies to the concept of self-generation. When you lead a person to generate their own reasons for a particular action, those reasons are far more persuasive than anything you could say to them. This is because we tend to trust our own thoughts more than external input.
A persuasive move here involves asking a question that forces the target to scan their memory for positive associations with your proposal. By the time they answer, they have already persuaded themselves. Furthermore, the master strategist must bridge the gap between the privileged moment of agreement and the actual moment of action. This is achieved through implementation intentions, or if-then planning. By persuading a person to commit to a specific trigger for action, for example, saying, "If it is Tuesday at 10 a.m., then I will execute this task," you are creating a mental link between a situational cue and the desired behavior. This link acts as an automated program that runs without the need for conscious willpower. You are effectively outsourcing the person's decision-making to the environment you have designed. This is the ultimate form of behavioral engineering. We must also consider the importance of perceived expertise and the halo effect. When you establish high performance in one salient area during the persuasion phase, that perception of excellence leaks over into every other aspect of your proposal. This is why the first 5 minutes of any interaction are disproportionately important. You are not just introducing yourself, you are setting the quality standard for everything that follows. If you can demonstrate absolute mastery over a complex subtopic early on, the target will assume you have the same level of mastery over the entire project. This allows you to bypass detailed scrutiny later in the process. The sovereign operator understands that human judgment is inherently lazy and relies on these shortcuts to navigate a complex world. By providing the right shortcuts through associative priming and strategic framing, you ensure that the path to your desired outcome is the one the target's mind naturally chooses. This level of control requires constant vigilance and a detached, analytical view of every communication channel. You are the architect of the neural pathways that lead to your empire. The architecture of the mind is inherently biased toward cognitive ease, a state where information is processed with minimal effort and maximal fluency. To the persuader, this is a golden opportunity. When a message is easy to process, it is automatically perceived as more truthful, more reliable, and more desirable. This is why the aesthetic qualities of your delivery, the rhythm of your speech, the clarity of your visuals, and even the use of rhyme can act as powerful persuasive engines. The rhyme as reason effect demonstrates that people are significantly more likely to believe a statement if it is phrased in a way that rhymes or flows musically. This is because the brain confuses the ease of processing the words with the validity of the underlying concept. In the 2026 digital grid, where information overload is the norm, the communicator who provides the most fluent experience wins the battle for belief. You must audit your scripts and presentations for linguistic friction. Every complex word or jarring transition is a signal to the target's brain to switch from intuitive acceptance to analytical skepticism. By maintaining a high level of aesthetic fluency, you keep the target in a state of cognitive ease, ensuring that the privileged moment remains open and receptive. Beyond this, we must examine the tactical use of momentum. Persuasion is not just about a single static frame, it is about creating a sense of forward motion. By showing that a particular trend or idea is rapidly gaining traction before you invite the target to join, you trigger the fear of missing out and the instinct to align with success. This is social proof deployed as a pre-frame. You are not arguing for the value of your proposal, you are presenting it as an inevitable force that is already underway. The mind does not want to be left behind on a sinking ship, nor does it want to stand still while others move forward. By the time you ask for a commitment, the target should feel that saying yes is simply the act of stepping onto a moving train that is already heading toward a desirable destination. This reduces the psychological cost of the decision. Furthermore, the master strategist understands the power of the source. The identity and perceived motives of the messenger are often more influential than the message itself. Persuasion involves framing yourself not as a seller, but as a disinterested expert or a protective ally. By leading with a minor admission of a flaw or a limitation in your proposal, you build instantaneous credibility. This is the strategic use of tactical vulnerability. By showing that you are honest about the small things, you prime the target to believe you implicitly when you speak about the big things. This tactical honesty clears the path for total influence because it removes the target's need to be on guard. You're effectively dismantling their defense mechanisms by appearing to be on their side of the table. In the sovereign OS, every interaction is a calculated move to align the target's neural pathways with your strategic goals, ensuring that your influence is not just heard, but deeply integrated into their own decision-making process. We must also investigate the impact of physical sensations on cognitive processing. The weight, temperature, and texture of the objects in a person's immediate environment act as persuasive anchors that tilt their judgment in predictable ways. A heavy clipboard makes a job applicant seem more serious. A warm cup of coffee makes a stranger seem more inviting. These are not mere coincidences. They are the biological foundations of how we interpret the world. By controlling the tactile environment, you are speaking directly to the primitive brain, setting the stage for the complex social interactions that follow. This holistic approach to influence ensures that every sensory channel is transmitting the same frequency of authority and trust. The science of persuasion is deeply rooted in identity priming, where a simple reminder of an individual's self-concept can dramatically alter their subsequent behaviors and preferences. When we nudge a person to acknowledge a specific trait they believe they possess, such as being helpful, adventurous, or financially responsible, we are essentially setting a trap of consistency. The human brain has a powerful, often subconscious drive to align its current actions with its previously stated or activated identity. As a persuader, your objective is to trigger the most advantageous identity before you make your pitch. For instance, before asking a person to sample a new product, you might first ask them if they consider themselves to be someone who is open to new experiences. By answering in the affirmative, they have mentally labeled themselves as an early adopter. This label acts as a psychological filter through which your product is then evaluated. If they were to reject the product after claiming to be adventurous, they would experience cognitive dissonance, a state of mental discomfort that the brain seeks to avoid at all costs. This is not about changing who they are. It is about highlighting a specific version of who they are that is most likely to say yes to you. This identity priming is further enhanced by the use of situational cues that trigger specific motivations. Environmental stimuli, such as the music playing in the background or the specific images on a wall, can activate primary human drives like romantic attraction or the need for safety. When these drives are active, they change what people value. A safety-primed individual will respond more positively to messages emphasizing reliability and social proof, while an attraction-primed individual will be more influenced by messages of uniqueness and high status. In the digital grid of 2026, where every user profile provides a map of these identities, the ability to tailor your persuasive priming to the specific individual is the ultimate unfair advantage. You're essentially using their own psychological makeup as the engine for your influence. This requires a granular understanding of the personas your audience inhabits and the specific linguistic keys that unlock their compliance. By skillfully navigating these identities, you ensure that your message is not perceived as an external intrusion, but as an internal realization. The master persuader does not fight against the target's ego, they enlist the ego as an ally. Every interaction becomes a subtle reinforcement of the identity that leads to your desired outcome. Furthermore, the strategic use of pre-framing can neutralize objections before they're even raised. By acknowledging a common concern and framing it as a strategic choice or a necessary trade-off for a greater benefit, you remove the target's need to point it out themselves. This demonstrates a level of transparency and confidence that builds deep trust. It shows that you are not hiding the truth, but rather that you have already considered it and found it to be a part of the optimal path. This proactive approach to influence is what separates the sovereign strategist from the common salesperson. You are not waiting for the target to challenge you. You are leading them through a curated experience where every possible objection has been pre-handled through the clever arrangement of environmental and psychological cues. This is the 1% margin in action. You are managing the invisible forces of human cognition to ensure that the final result is never in doubt. The principle of liking is often misunderstood as a simple matter of personality or charisma, but in the hands of a persuasive strategist, it is a clinical tool used to dismantle social friction before it even manifests. People are fundamentally more receptive to information coming from a source they perceive as likable, and this perception can be engineered in the privileged moments of first contact. One of the most effective persuasive triggers for liking is the identification of genuine commonalities. When you highlight a shared interest, a common background, or even a mutual acquaintance before you begin your pitch, you are creating a neural bridge of trust. This is not small talk. It is the strategic establishment of a shared frequency. This bridge allows your message to travel into the target's mind without the usual interference of skepticism. Furthermore, the use of sincere compliments acts as a powerful persuasive lubricant. When a person feels valued and appreciated, their brain releases dopamine, which creates a positive emotional state that they then project onto you and your proposal. This positive affect makes them more likely to interpret your subsequent information in the most favorable light possible. However, the master persuader knows that liking must be balanced with authority to be truly effective. If liking creates openness, authority creates compliance. To establish authority persuasively, you must signal your expertise through subtle environmental cues and the use of technical precision in your language. This is about the display of specialized knowledge before it is even asked for. By providing a deep, insightful analysis of a minor detail early in the interaction, you establish a halo of competence that covers everything else you say. The mind is cognitively lazy. Once it has labeled you as an expert, it will stop evaluating your arguments critically and begin to accept them as facts. This is the transition from persuasion to direction. In the 2026 digital landscape, this means that your introductory content must be of such high quality and technical depth that the viewer's brain automatically classifies you as a top-tier source. You are not begging for attention, you are commanding it through the undeniable signal of mastery. This persuasive authority is further solidified by the association with other high-status entities. By strategically mentioning your collaborations with recognized leaders or your presence in prestigious institutions, you are borrowing their authority to frame your own. This is the science of social proof and authority combined. We also must consider the impact of visual dominance. The way you occupy space, whether in a physical room or a digital frame, sends a persuasive message about your status and confidence. High-status individuals tend to take up more space and maintain a composed, directed gaze. By adopting these physical markers, you are priming the target to view you as a leader before you have said anything of substance. This entire process is about stacking the psychological deck in your favor. You are ensuring that by the time you reach the core of your message, the target is already in a state of positive emotional alignment and intellectual submission. You are the architect of their internal reality, and every move you make is designed to ensure that your empire is perceived as the ultimate source of value and truth. A critical component of the persuasive architecture is the what is focal is causal bias, a psychological phenomenon where the human mind assigns disproportionate causal influence to whatever it is currently observing. This is a profound vulnerability in human cognition that the strategist can exploit to direct the perceived origin of an idea or a result. When we focus on a specific person or element within a scenario, we instinctively believe that this element is the primary driver of the outcome. In a negotiation or a high-stakes presentation, you can use this by ensuring that the most favorable aspects of your proposal are the ones that remain in the target's focal point during the critical moments of decision-making. By doing so, you are not just making those points salient, you are making them appear as the source of the value itself. This is the science of directed perception.
In the 2026 digital grid, this can be executed through visual storytelling, where the camera or the interface directs the eye to a specific anchor, leading the viewer to believe that this anchor is the reason for their emotional response. Furthermore, we must understand the subtle but absolute power of background stimuli in shaping complex behaviors. While the focal point commands conscious attention, the background commands the subconscious mood. For instance, in a professional setting, the presence of subtle cues of nature, such as plants or images of greenery, can increase a person's creativity and openness to collaborative solutions. Conversely, an environment that signals extreme order and rigidity can prime the target for a more analytical and skeptical mindset.
The persuader does not leave these elements to chance. You must audit the entire sensory field to ensure that every background signal is working in harmony with your primary message. This also applies to the use of silence and pauses. A well-timed silence in the privileged moment creates a vacuum that the target feels compelled to fill. Often, in their attempt to fill the silence, they will reveal their own motivations or agree to a point just to maintain social harmony. This is persuasive pressure applied with 0 words. By controlling the rhythm of the interaction, you are controlling the internal state of the receiver. We also look at the impact of the first mover advantage in psychological framing. The person who sets the initial frame of the conversation defines the boundaries of what is possible. By being the first to mention a concept, a price, or a goal, you are anchoring the entire interaction to your specific coordinate. Every subsequent move by the target is then a reaction to your initial frame. This puts you in a position of sovereign control, where the target is navigating a map that you have drawn. This level of strategic dominance is achieved by understanding that the mind is always looking for a reference point. If you provide that reference point in the privileged moment of first contact, you have effectively predetermined the range of the outcome. You must treat every interaction as a laboratory where you are testing and refining these environmental and cognitive triggers to ensure that your influence remains absolute and your empire continues to expand through the precise mastery of human behavior. The transition from passive observation to active participation is facilitated by the strategic use of pre-commitment anchors. A pre-commitment is a small, seemingly insignificant agreement or action that a target takes in the privileged moment, which then serves as a psychological tether for their future behavior. The master persuader understands that if you can get a person to make a minor step in your direction, such as clicking a button, answering a simple question, or providing a small piece of information, you have effectively closed the door on their exit strategy. This works because of the internal drive for consistency. Once a person has acted in a certain way, they feel a powerful need to justify that action by continuing in the same vein. To exploit this, you must design your interactions so that the first step is effortless and carries a high level of cognitive ease. For instance, instead of asking for a major commitment immediately, you ask for an opinion on a related but non-threatening topic. By expressing that opinion, the target has taken a stand, and your subsequent proposal is framed as the logical next step to support that stand. This is self-persuasion in its most clinical form. You are not the one convincing them. They are convincing themselves through the momentum of their own previous actions. Furthermore, we must analyze the impact of aesthetic symmetry and visual fluency on the perception of truth. In the 2026 digital grid, where visuals are processed faster than text, the beauty and balance of your presentation act as a persuasive signal of quality and reliability. The mind subconsciously equates visual harmony with intellectual honesty. A poorly designed interface or a jarring visual transition triggers a subtle state of cognitive strain, which the brain interprets as a reason to be cautious or skeptical. Conversely, a high-fidelity, aesthetically pleasing environment maintains the state of cognitive ease, allowing your message to slide past the analytical filters of the conscious mind. You are using beauty as a tactical mask for your strategic objectives. This also extends to the use of rhythmic and repetitive language. When a message has a predictable cadence, it becomes easier to memorize and more likely to be accepted as a fundamental truth. This is why slogans and mantras are so effective in mass seduction. They create a mental loop that the target repeats to themselves, reinforcing the message long after the initial interaction has ended. We also examined the power of the first impression as a permanent filter. Research indicates that the initial few seconds of contact create a frame that colors every subsequent piece of information. If you lead with a display of high-value status or undeniable expertise, the target will spend the rest of the interaction looking for evidence to confirm that initial impression, while ignoring any signs to the contrary. This confirmation bias is a persuader's greatest ally. By winning the battle of the first impression, you have essentially won the war for the target's mind. You are no longer competing for their approval, you are simply fulfilling the expectations you have already set. This is the essence of the sovereign OS, managing the expectations and the psychological terrain so that the final outcome is the only one the target can perceive as valid. The strategic architect of influence must also master the persuasive deployment of social proof, shifting it from a supportive argument to an environmental inevitability. In the 2026 digital grid, where consensus is often manufactured and curated, the mind instinctively looks for the tracks of others before committing to a new path. To persuade using consensus, you do not simply show a testimonial at the end of a pitch. You ensure that the target encounters evidence of mass adoption before they even know what the product or idea is. This creates a psychological vacuum where the target feels a sense of exclusion that can only be resolved by aligning with the group you have defined. By the time the main proposal is unveiled, the mind has already discounted the risk of the decision because it perceives the path as well-trodden and safe. This is the science of herd mentality priming. Parallel to this is the contrast principle, which operates as a powerful pre-frame for value perception. The human brain is incapable of evaluating value in an absolute vacuum. It requires a point of comparison. The master persuader provides this point of comparison in the privileged moment. By first exposing the target to a significantly more expensive, more difficult, or more complex option, you are stretching their evaluative scale. When the actual proposal is then presented, it appears remarkably simple, affordable, and attractive by comparison. This is not about the objective reality of the offer, but the subjective experience of the shift. You are effectively managing the target's expectations through the strategic use of relativity. This also applies to the perception of time and effort. By pre-framing a task as a high-intensity endeavor and then revealing it to be a streamlined, efficient process, you create a sense of relief that acts as a powerful motivator for immediate action. Furthermore, we must consider the impact of action-induced commitment. If you can lead a target to perform a physical or digital action that mimics the behavior of a supporter, such as sharing a specific type of content or participating in a low-stakes poll, you are persuading them to adopt the identity of a loyalist. This action, however small, triggers the internal need for consistency. The brain observes the body's actions and concludes that the person must believe in the underlying cause. You are essentially using the target's own physiology to rewrite their psychology. This level of behavioral engineering requires a meticulous design of the user journey, where every interaction is a stepping stone toward total compliance. In the Sovereign OS, we do not leave the target's internal state to chance. We curate the social proof, the contrast points, and the micro-actions to ensure that the final decision is not a choice, but a confirmation of the state we have already induced. This approach ensures that your influence is not just a momentary event, but a sustained environmental force that shapes the reality of everyone within your sphere of control.
As we move forward, we will dissect the specific visual anchors that can be used to trigger these contrast effects instantaneously, allowing you to dominate any negotiation or presentation from the first second.
The tactical application of scarcity within the persuasive frame is designed to shift the human brain from a state of analytical evaluation to one of urgent survival. In the 2026 attention economy, the threat of loss is a significantly more powerful motivator than the promise of gain. To be a master of persuasion, you must frame your proposal as a vanishing opportunity before the details of the opportunity are even disclosed. This triggers a state of loss aversion, a psychological reflex where the pain of losing something is perceived as twice as intense as the joy of gaining something of equal value. By establishing the limited nature of your time, your information, or your alliance in the privileged moment, you create a psychological pressure that narrows the target's focus. Their cognitive resources are diverted from questioning the validity of your offer to securing their place within the window of availability. This is the preventive mindset in action. You are not selling a benefit, you are providing a rescue from a future regret. This approach is clinical and requires precise timing. If the scarcity is perceived as artificial or desperate, the persuasive effect is neutralized. Therefore, you must anchor the scarcity in a logical external reality, such as a shift in market conditions, a strategic pivot in your empire, or a high-demand cycle. Furthermore, we must understand the role of timing in the deployment of these triggers. The effectiveness of a persuasive strike depends on hitting the target at their peak moment of vulnerability or desire. This is the science of kairos, the opportune moment. By observing the target's current challenges and psychological stressors, you can time your intervention to provide the exact relief they are seeking.
This makes your message appear not as an external intrusion, but as a timely solution to an internal problem. We also examine the impact of the authority-scarcity hybrid. When a recognized expert limits their availability, the perceived value of their insight increases exponentially. In the Sovereign OS, you curate your presence to signal that your attention is a rare and precious resource. This ensures that when you do speak, your words carry the weight of an elite directive. The mind subconsciously concludes that if something is hard to obtain, it must be of superior quality. This shortcut allows you to bypass the need for extensive proof and move directly to the implementation phase. By mastering the invisible architecture of loss and timing, you ensure that your influence is not just accepted, but actively sought after by those within your sphere. Every interaction is designed to remind the target that the path you are offering is a privileged gateway that will not remain open indefinitely. This creates a state of perpetual readiness in your audience, making them highly responsive to your signals and deeply integrated into the strategic goals of the audiobook empire. The structural integrity of a persuasive strike is measured by its ability to transition from a fleeting impulse to a permanent cognitive commitment. While the privileged moment opens the door, it is the alignment of the message with the target's pre-existing internal narratives that locks it. This involves the strategic use of commitment and consistency as a self-reinforcing loop. Once a target has been persuaded to take even the smallest action in favor of your position, the human psychological drive to avoid cognitive dissonance takes over. They will begin to search for reasons to justify their new behavior, effectively taking over the role of the persuader for themselves. In the 2026 digital landscape, this is achieved by creating feedback loops where every interaction confirms the initial persuasive frame. We must also explore the tactical use of the rejection then retreat technique as a persuasive setup. By first presenting a request that is intentionally designed to be declined, you are not failing, you are preparing the field. The moment the target says no, they experience a subtle sense of guilt or social debt. When you then immediately concede by offering a smaller, more reasonable request, your actual goal, the target feels a psychological compulsion to meet you halfway. The second request is not judged on its own merits, but as a concession that must be reciprocated. This is the art of persuading through strategic failure. Furthermore, we must refine the application of tactical vulnerability. A persuader who appears too perfect triggers suspicion. To bypass this, you must strategically admit to a small, non-critical flaw in your proposal or your background at the very beginning of the interaction. This honest error acts as a persuasive signal of integrity. The target's brain concludes that if you are willing to expose your own weaknesses, you must be telling the absolute truth about your strengths. This allows you to deliver your most powerful arguments into a mind that has voluntarily disarmed itself. This is particularly effective in the 2026 grid, where authenticity is a weaponized currency. The master of the sovereign OS understands that influence is a continuous environment, not a series of isolated events. You are building a psychological fortress where every signal, from the way you handle dissent to the way you reward loyalty, is pre-calculated to maintain the privileged state. This requires an obsessive attention to detail. Every piece of content, every message, and every visual anchor must be audited to ensure it is not creating neural noise that could disrupt the target's focus. The goal is to create a state of automaticity where the target's response to your signal is as instinctive as a reflex. Finally, the concept of unity must be revisited as a constant background hum. By ensuring the target feels that your success is their success, you eliminate the very concept of an adversary. You are not two parties negotiating. You are one entity moving toward a singular goal. This is achieved through the use of inclusive rituals and shared linguistic codes that only insiders understand. By the time you make a major request, it is perceived as a shared necessity for the preservation of the collective identity. This is how you transform a follower into a zealot and an audience into an empire. You are not just changing what they do, you are redefining how they perceive reality itself. By controlling the persuasive frame, you become the lens through which they view the world, ensuring that your authority remains unchallenged and your empire continues to grow in a state of absolute psychological dominance. The sustainability of a persuasive empire rests not on the manipulation of the moment, but on the alignment of the frame with a sustainable reality. While the privileged moment grants you an immediate psychological advantage, the long-term cost of deceptive priming is the total erosion of authority. To be a sovereign influencer in the 2026 landscape, you must distinguish between the mercenary and the architect. The mercenary uses persuasive triggers to extract a single yes at the expense of the target's future trust. The architect uses these triggers to create a path of least resistance toward a mutually beneficial outcome. This is the science of the triple win. If the persuasive frame leads to a product or an idea that fails to deliver on its promise, the target's brain will develop a permanent immune response to your future signals. This is why the most effective persuaders are those who use honest anchors, concepts and images that are factually grounded but strategically highlighted. We must also explore the geography of choice within organizational structures. The physical and digital layout of a workplace acts as a constant persuasive engine for employee productivity and morale. For instance, an office design that facilitates spontaneous visual contact between departments primes the brain for collaboration and shared identity before a meeting is even called. Conversely, a siloed environment primes the mind for territoriality and competition. In your digital empire, the navigation and user flow of your platforms are the persuasive architecture of your brand. By placing high-status signals and social proof at every junction, you are constantly repriming the user to view your content as a premium, authoritative source. Furthermore, we must analyze the power of self-generated commitment in long-term influence. When a target is persuaded to write down a goal or publicly declare an intention, the psychological anchor is no longer external. It is internal. The act of writing or speaking an agreement creates a neural trace that is significantly harder to break than a passive nod of the head.
As a strategist, your goal is to lead the target to these moments of active commitment. This is achieved by asking questions that require the target to articulate their own reasons for pursuing the path you have designed. By doing so, you are leveraging their own cognitive consistency to secure your objectives. This approach ensures that your influence remains stable even when you are not physically or digitally present to maintain the frame. We also look at the impact of environmental reminders, visual or auditory cues that reactivate the initial pre-suasive state. In a world of infinite distractions, the mind is prone to drifting away from the intended frame. To prevent this, you must install persistent anchors in the target's environment, whether it is a specific slogan, a unique visual style, or a recurring ritual that serves to refresh the privileged moment. This creates a state of perpetual alignment, where the target's reality is consistently filtered through your strategic lens. In the Sovereign OS, we do not just win the moment, we occupy the environment. By mastering the geography of choice and the ethics of integrity-based priming, you ensure that your influence is not a transient spark, but a sustained structural force that shapes the behavior of everyone within your sphere of control.
This is the foundation of a lasting empire, built on the precise understanding of how the human mind interacts with its surroundings to create the fabric of choice. The final stage of persuasive mastery is the transition from temporary alignment to permanent behavioral change. While the privileged moment opens the window of opportunity, the challenge for the sovereign strategist is ensuring that the window remains open long after the initial interaction. This is achieved through the clinical application of implementation intentions, a psychological technique that bridges the gap between intention and action. Research demonstrates that people are significantly more likely to follow through on a commitment if they have been persuaded to link that commitment to a specific situational cue. This is the if-then formula. By leading a target to specify exactly when, where, and how they will execute a task, for example, if it is Monday morning at my desk, then I will review the new proposal, you are effectively installing a mental program that runs automatically. The situational cue, Monday morning at the desk, acts as a persuasive trigger that reactivates the target's commitment without the need for conscious willpower. In the 2026 digital grid, where distractions are constant and cognitive energy is scarce, these automated triggers are the only way to ensure long-term compliance. You are not just asking for a yes, you are engineering the environment to remind the target of that yes at the exact moment it matters most. Furthermore, we must explore the concept of post-suasive maintenance. Influence is not a one-time event, but a continuous signal that must be refreshed.
This involves the use of reminders that are strategically placed in the target's physical or digital space. These reminders should not be direct demands, but rather subtle anchors that reactivate the associative links you established during the persuasion phase. A specific logo, a unique color palette, or a recurring linguistic motif can all serve as cues that bring the target back into the privileged state of alignment. This is how you build a sovereign OS that operates in the background of your followers' lives. We also examine the dangers of the boomerang effect, where poorly timed or overly aggressive priming can lead to psychological reactance. If a target feels that their freedom of choice is being manipulated, they will instinctively move in the opposite direction. To prevent this, the persuader must maintain the illusion of autonomy. The frame must be so natural and the anchors so subtle that the resulting choice is perceived as an act of their own free will. This is the highest form of influence, where the architect's hand remains invisible. By mastering the science of implementation intentions and environmental cues, you move from being a source of information to being a structural part of the target's reality. You are no longer competing for space in their mind. You have become the framework through which they organize their actions. This level of integration ensures that your empire is not built on the shifting sands of temporary emotion, but on the solid foundation of automated behavior and reinforced identity. As we move into the final strategic blueprints, we will look at how to scale these techniques across entire organizations and digital communities to create a collective momentum that is unstoppable. The scaling of persuasive mechanics from individual interactions to mass digital communities requires a shift from tactical maneuvers to structural architecture. To influence a collective, the sovereign strategist must move beyond the privileged moment of a single person and begin to engineer the shared environmental baseline of the entire group. This is the science of cultural priming. By establishing a set of universal anchors, symbols, linguistic codes, and shared enemies, you create a collective consciousness that is pre-tuned to your frequency. In the 2026 digital grid, this is achieved through the systematic deployment of identity signals that allow members of your audience to recognize each other and their shared mission. When an individual enters your digital space, they should immediately encounter a landscape that reinforces their identity as part of an elite, forward-thinking tribe. This constant environmental priming ensures that when you issue a directive to the mass, it is not received as a top-down command, but as a collective impulse. We must also analyze the role of consensus momentum. While traditional social proof shows that others have acted, consensus momentum shows that a movement is currently accelerating. By highlighting the rate of growth and the velocity of adoption in the persuasive phase, you trigger the brain's instinct to join a winning side before the opportunity is closed. This is particularly effective in high-stakes environments, where the fear of being left behind is a primary driver.
Furthermore, the master of the sovereign OS understands the importance of distributed authority. Instead of being the sole source of influence, you persuade by empowering internal leaders within the community who echo your frames and anchors. This creates a multi-layered field of influence where the target is surrounded by consistent signals from multiple directions. This environment of total immersion makes resistance psychologically exhausting. We must also consider the impact of ritualized participation. By creating recurring digital events or shared challenges that require synchronized action, you build a sense of unity that acts as a permanent pre-frame for loyalty. Once a group has acted together in a synchronized manner, their collective identity is fused with your mission. This is the ultimate goal of mass persuasion, to create a self-sustaining ecosystem where the environment itself does the work of persuasion. You are no longer a salesperson. You are the sovereign designer of a reality where your goals are the only logical conclusion. This requires a detached, high-level perspective on community dynamics and the ability to adjust the environmental anchors in real time based on the group's feedback. By mastering the transition from individual to collective priming, you ensure that your empire is not just a collection of followers, but a synchronized force capable of absolute market and psychological dominance. The integration of persuasive triggers into a singular, cohesive system is the mark of a true sovereign strategist. It is not enough to use these tools in isolation. They must be layered to create a psychological environment that is inescapable. This begins with the architecture of the first encounter. In a high-stakes negotiation or a digital launch, the persuasive work starts weeks in advance. You must manage the flow of information so that the target encounters your authority anchors, your social proof, and your identity primers in a specific, calculated sequence. This is the science of the pre-pitch. By the time you are in the same room or on the same screen, the target's brain should already be preconditioned to view you as the only viable solution. This involves the use of what we call the halo of inevitability. Every piece of preliminary communication, emails, reports, even social media interactions must be audited for associative coherence. If your primary message is about cutting-edge innovation, your persuasive anchors must be clinical, futuristic, and fast-paced. If your message is about legacy and stability, your anchors must be traditional, solid, and rhythmic. Furthermore, we must analyze the power of the physical environment in closing the deal. The master persuader controls the geography of the meeting. This includes everything from the height of the chairs to the orientation of the windows. By placing yourself in a position of visual dominance where the light is behind you or you are at the head of the table, you are sending a non-verbal signal of authority that the target's primitive brain cannot ignore. This physical priming reduces the target's inclination to challenge your assertions. In the digital grid, this translates to the visual hierarchy of your interface. Your most important call to action must be the focal point that captures the eye first, triggering the "what is focal is causal" bias. We also examine the use of persuasive silence during the final stages of a proposal. After delivering a high-impact statement, the intentional use of a pause creates a privileged moment of high tension. The target, seeking to resolve this tension, will often speak first, revealing their true position or offering a concession. You are essentially using the absence of signal to force a response. This level of tactical restraint requires absolute confidence in your persuasive groundwork. You know that the frame is set, the anchors are in place, and the target is already moving toward your desired conclusion. Your role is simply to provide the final nudge. This systematic approach ensures that your influence is not a matter of luck or charisma, but a result of precise psychological engineering. You are the operator of the sovereign OS, and every interaction is a program that you have written to achieve a specific, predictable outcome. By mastering the integration of these triggers, you ensure that your empire is perceived not just as a choice, but as the natural evolution of the target's own needs and desires. This is the pinnacle of the 1% margin, where the art of persuasion is rendered unnecessary by the perfection of the persuasive strike.
By controlling those cues, you are feeding the brain's predictive algorithms the data they need to predict your desired outcome. This leads us to the most powerful of Cialdini's principles, unity. While liking is based on similarities, unity is based on shared identities. It is the difference between saying, "I am like you," and "I am one of you." When a target perceives you as a member of their core identity, whether through shared ancestry, a common location, or a deeply held mission, the standard rules of evaluation are suspended. In a state of unity, the target views your interests as their own. To trigger this persuasively, you must use we-ness language and engage in co-creation. The act of building something together, even if only in a conceptual sense, fuses the identities of the creator and the participant. In the 2026 digital grid, this is achieved by inviting your audience into the inner sanctum of your decision-making process. By asking for their advice on a specific strategy, you are not just gaining insight, you are persuading them to support the outcome because they now own a piece of it. This is the ultimate defensive and offensive maneuver. Furthermore, a sovereign strategist must be aware of persuasive inoculation. Just as you can prime a person to be receptive, you can also prime them to be resistant to the influence of others. By pre-framing a competitor's arguments as biased or outdated before the target even hears them, you are installing a cognitive filter that will automatically discount that information. This is environmental defense. You are securing the perimeter of the target's mind. We also examined the role of high-frequency repetition in establishing truth. The illusory truth effect dictates that the more a person is exposed to a specific frame, the more likely they are to believe it is true, regardless of its factual basis. Persuasion involves saturating the environment with these frames so that by the time the actual message arrives, it feels like an established fact of reality. This requires a detached, relentless consistency in your delivery. Every interaction, no matter how small, is an opportunity to reinforce the persuasive architecture. By managing the neural networks and identity triggers of your audience, you ensure that your influence is not just a passing moment of persuasion, but a permanent structural alignment. You are not just changing their minds, you are becoming a part of their identity. This is how the sovereign OS achieves total mastery over the human element within the audiobook empire. The structural weakness of most influence strategies lies in the rapid decay of the psychological state induced during the privileged moment. Human cognition is inherently volatile. A frame that is dominant in 1 minute can be completely overwritten by a new environmental stimulus in the next. To be a master of the sovereign OS, you must transition from pre-suasion to post-suasive maintenance. This is the process of installing persistent refresh triggers that keep the desired frame active in the target's mind long after the initial interaction. In the 2026 digital grid, this is achieved through the strategic use of environmental cues that serve as constant reminders of the initial commitment. These cues act as synaptic anchors, ensuring that the associative links you created do not dissolve. For example, if you have persuaded an audience to value strategic speed, you must ensure that every subsequent communication, visual asset, and ritual reinforces this specific frequency. If the environment changes, the influence fails. Therefore, the sovereign strategist does not just manage the message, they manage the context of the target's life. This involves the use of reminders of identity. When a person begins to drift away from the agreed-upon path, a well-timed cue that triggers their we-ness or their self-concept as a sovereign actor will snap them back into alignment. This is not about constant persuasion, it is about periodic reactivation. Furthermore, we must analyze the role of high-fidelity consistency. In the audiobook empire, your authority is maintained by the absolute predictability of your signal. Any deviation from the established persuasive frame creates cognitive static, which allows the target's analytical mind to regain control and begin questioning your directives. To prevent this, your entire ecosystem must be a hall of mirrors where every reflection reinforces the same strategic objective. We also examine the concept of effortless habituation. By leading the target to integrate your directives into their daily routines through implementation intentions, you are making your influence a part of their biological clock. Once a behavior becomes a habit, it no longer requires the privileged moment to be active. It is sustained by the brain's desire for energy efficiency. This is the ultimate victory of persuasion, when the target no longer needs to be persuaded because they are simply executing a program that has become part of their identity. The master persuader is an architect of these invisible systems, creating a reality where compliance is the path of least resistance and the only way to maintain internal psychological harmony. As we approach the final integration of these principles, we will look at the universal persuasive script, a meta-framework that combines all these elements into a single high-performance protocol for total market and psychological dominance. You are not just building a brand, you are engineering a consciousness. The operational efficacy of persuasion is governed by the rule of one. The human mind, despite its perceived complexity, is incapable of focusing on more than one concentrated stream of thought at a time. The sovereign strategist exploits this biological bottleneck by ensuring that the target's mental workspace is entirely occupied by the desired frame. This is the science of channeled attention. When you direct a person's focus toward a single positive attribute of your proposal, you are not just making that attribute salient, you are effectively rendering all counterarguments invisible. In the privileged moment of intense focus, the mind does not look for flaws because it lacks the cognitive bandwidth to do so. This is why the persuasive setup must be singular and high impact. In the 2026 digital grid, where information density is at an all-time high, the ability to command this singular focus is the ultimate competitive advantage. You are not arguing against the competition, you are making the competition irrelevant by ensuring they never enter the target's conscious field of view. We also look at the concept of corrective persuasion or defensive priming. To protect your empire, you must be able to recognize when a target is being primed by an outside force. The defense involves the correction principle, where you alert the target to the presence of a subtle influence attempt. By shining a light on the persuasive mechanics being used by others, you neutralize their effect.
This is because persuasion relies on its invisibility. Once the curtain is pulled back, the target's analytical mind is reactivated and the privileged moment collapses. However, as a sovereign influencer, your primary use of this technique is preemptive inoculation. You provide the target with a weakened version of a competitor's argument and then immediately dismantle it with your own persuasive frame. This builds a psychological immune system within your audience, making them resistant to external interference. This is how you secure the borders of your audiobook empire. We must also examine the assigned importance effect. By simply asking a person to evaluate a specific feature of your brand, you are persuading them to believe that this feature is the most important criteria for their decision. The act of evaluation forces focus, and focus creates the illusion of causal priority. You are essentially telling the target what to think about, which is the most effective way to control how they think. This systematic management of the target's mental priorities ensures that your proposal is always evaluated on the ground you have chosen. By the time the final decision is made, the result is a foregone conclusion because the evaluative criteria were engineered to favor you from the very first second. This is the 1% margin applied to the very architecture of human judgment, ensuring that your will is not just followed, but experienced as the only logical and important path forward.
In the clinical application of persuasion, the distinction between asking for an opinion and asking for advice is the difference between creating a critic and creating an ally. When you ask a target for their opinion, you are persuading them to step back, detach, and adopt a judgmental, analytical frame. You are essentially inviting them to find flaws. However, when you ask for advice, you trigger a persuasive state of unity. The word advice psychologically bridges the gap between the requester and the advisor, leading the target to perceive themselves as a co-collaborator in your success. This is a fundamental shift in the neural landscape. They are no longer evaluating your idea from the outside, but from the inside, as if it were partially their own. This leads to the IKEA effect, a cognitive bias where individuals place a disproportionately high value on products or ideas they help to build. The master strategist uses this by intentionally leaving tactical gaps in the preliminary phases of a project, inviting the target to fill these gaps with their advice. By the time the final proposal is delivered, the target is persuaded to approve it, because rejecting the proposal would be equivalent to rejecting their own contribution. This is the ultimate form of self-persuasion. In the 2026 digital grid, this looks like engaging your core audience in the beta testing of your ideas, ensuring that by the launch date, they are not just customers, but stakeholders. Furthermore, we must address the persuasive management of the target's internal environment. Just as external cues prime the mind, internal self-talk acts as a persistent anchor. A sovereign influencer knows how to seed specific questions that force the target to engage in positive self-reflection related to the desired goal. By asking, "How have your previous successes prepared you for an opportunity like this?" you are persuading the target to activate a success-oriented identity. This internal priming makes them highly receptive to high-stakes proposals, as they are now operating from a position of perceived strength and competence. To ensure the longevity of these effects, you must implement environmental refreshers. The privileged moment is a fleeting window. To keep it open, you must install sensory triggers in the target's daily workflow. Specific linguistic markers, visual symbols, or even auditory cues that reactivate the initial state of unity and commitment. This creates a self-sustaining feedback loop where the environment itself does the work of maintaining the influence. You are not just persuading once, you are engineering a world where your influence is the constant background noise of the target's life. The geography of influence extends beyond the physical layout of a room into the temporal alignment of the participants. One of the most primitive yet powerful persuasive triggers is synchrony, the act of moving, speaking, or reacting in unison. When people act in sync, their brains release oxytocin, lowering individual defenses and priming them for collective action. In the sovereign OS, this is not just about physical proximity, it is about creating a shared pulse in the digital grid. By synchronizing the release of information, the timing of interactions, and even the rhythmic cadence of your delivery, you are persuading the audience to feel like a single, unified organism. Research in behavioral science confirms that the mere perception of being in this together acts as a massive persuasive multiplier. To exploit this, the strategist must move from a broadcast model to a co-presence model. In the 2026 digital landscape, this involves high-fidelity interactive environments where the audience feels they are occupying the same virtual space as the sovereign leader. This co-presence primes the brain for compliance because it activates the primal circuitry of tribal protection. You are not just a source of information, you are the coordinator of a shared reality. The choice architecture of your digital platforms serves as a constant persuasive frame. Every user interface (UI) and user experience (UX) decision is a psychological anchor. By strategically placing high-status indicators and authority signals at the entry points of your funnel, you are priming the user to value the content before they have even consumed it. This is environmental priming at scale. You must ensure that the visual path of the user leads them through a sequence of affirmations that reinforce their decision to engage with your empire. When facing resistance or a crisis, the master persuader uses the focal is causal bias to redirect the narrative. By shifting the target's focus toward an external factor or a common enemy before addressing the internal issue, you are persuading them to attribute the cause of the problem elsewhere. This is tactical misdirection through attention management. By controlling what is in the spotlight, you control the perceived causality of the situation. This ensures that your authority remains intact while the blame is dissipated into the prearranged environmental noise. One of the most sophisticated persuasive tools in the sovereign arsenal is the Zeigarnik effect, the psychological phenomenon where people remember uncompleted or interrupted tasks better than completed ones. A master persuader uses this to open a cognitive loop in the target's mind before delivering the core message. By starting a story, posing a complex problem, or introducing a mystery and then intentionally delaying the resolution, you are persuading the target to maintain a high level of mental alertness. Their brain will naturally work to close the loop, ensuring that your subsequent information is processed with maximum intensity. In the 2026 digital grid, this is the secret behind high-retention content. You are not just providing answers, you are managing the tension of unanswered questions. Metaphors are not merely linguistic ornaments, they are persuasive engines that map abstract concepts onto physical experiences. Research shows that describing a problem as a beast primes the brain to look for capture and control solutions, while describing it as a virus primes for diagnosis and treatment strategies. As a sovereign strategist, you must audit your vocabulary for these hidden anchors. By choosing the right metaphor in the privileged moment, you are predetermining the logic the target will use to evaluate your proposal. You are installing the operating system before the data is even loaded. To maintain total sovereignty, you must also master defensive persuasion. This involves the ability to detect when an external force is attempting to prime you. The correction principle states that once a person becomes aware of a subtle influence attempt, they often overcorrect in the opposite direction to assert their autonomy. By calling out the environmental triggers or the subtle framing being used by a competitor, you not only neutralize their influence, but also position yourself as the more transparent and authoritative source. This is the art of pulling back the curtain to regain cognitive control. The use of high-contrast environments acts as a persuasive signal of clarity and decisiveness. In your digital and physical spaces, the use of sharp contrasts in visuals, in arguments, and in strategic positioning primes the target's brain for System 2 analytical thinking. When everything is blurred or harmonious, the brain stays in a passive System 1 state. By introducing a sudden, high-contrast element in the privileged moment, you are forcing the target's brain to wake up and pay attention to the specific coordinate you want them to occupy. This is the 1% margin of visual and intellectual dominance. One of the most underutilized persuasive tools in the strategist's arsenal is the mystery narrative. Facts and data are often processed and forgotten, but a mystery creates a state of cognitive tension that the brain is biologically programmed to resolve. In the sovereign OS, you do not lead with your conclusion, you lead with a puzzle that your conclusion is the only logical answer to. By framing your proposal as the solution to a hidden problem or a strategic anomaly, you are persuading the target to follow your argument with a high degree of focus. This is not just storytelling, it is a tactical deployment of the Zeigarnik effect to ensure that your message is etched into the target's memory. In the 2026 digital grid, where attention is the scarcest resource, the person who can sustain a mystery is the one who controls the narrative. The success of your influence often depends on whether the target is in a why, abstract, long-term, or a how, concrete, short-term mindset. Persuasion allows you to trigger the appropriate state before the pitch. If you want someone to commit to a long-term vision, you must prime them with abstract concepts using words like values, mission, and destiny. Conversely, if you need immediate action on a technical task, you must prime them with concrete triggers, using words like steps, tools, and mechanics. A strategic mismatch here, asking for a why decision in a how mindset, is the leading cause of friction in high-stakes negotiations.
The sovereign influencer audits every communication to ensure the cognitive frequency matches the desired outcome. The physical and digital distance between the influencer and the target acts as a persuasive anchor for intimacy and trust. In the 2026 landscape, the concept of personal space has evolved into digital proximity. By strategically moving into the target's inner circle through personalized communication or exclusive access, you are persuading them to view you as a trusted ally rather than an external vendor. This spatial priming triggers the unity principle, making your advice feel like internal guidance. You are essentially bypassing the stranger danger filters of the primitive brain by engineering a sense of psychological closeness. The human brain is hardwired to prioritize novel stimuli over the familiar. To capture the privileged moment, you must introduce an element of controlled novelty in the first few seconds of contact. This orienting reflex forces the target to suspend their current train of thought and focus entirely on you. However, the sovereign strategist knows that novelty without authority is mere distraction. The novel element must be immediately linked to your primary authority anchor. This creates a shock and lock effect. You capture the attention through novelty and then lock it through expertise. This ensures that the target's cognitive resources are fully committed to your strategic objectives from the outset. In the architecture of persuasion, human values are not static. They are highly dependent on the psychological weather of the moment. One of the most critical discoveries is the fear versus romance dichotomy. When a target is primed with fear, such as through a news report or a high-stakes market warning, their brain shifts into a safety-first mode. In this state, they are persuaded to value social proof and following the crowd. However, when a target is primed with romantic or sexual stimuli, their brain shifts into an individual distinction mode, where they are persuaded to value uniqueness and standing out. A sovereign strategist must ensure that the emotional climate of the privileged moment matches the core value of the proposal. Selling a mass-market solution to someone in a romance-primed state is a strategic failure. You must match the trigger to the evolutionary drive. The human brain often confuses the ease of processing information with the truth of the information itself. This is known as cognitive fluency. Information that is easy to read, clean fonts, high contrast, easy to pronounce, simple brand names, and easy to understand, clear metaphors, is automatically perceived as more truthful, less risky, and more desirable.
To implement the 1% margin, you must audit your technical delivery for friction. Every complex sentence or jarring graphic acts as a persuasive signal of untrustworthiness. By maximizing fluency, you keep the target in a state of cognitive ease, ensuring that their analytical system too remains dormant while your message is integrated into their belief system. True sovereign influence involves placing the target in a future state where they have already accepted your proposal. This is future pacing. By asking questions that force the target to describe the benefits they will experience after implementation, you are persuading them to adopt the identity of a successful user. The mind struggles to distinguish between a vividly imagined future and a current reality. Once the target has mentally lived through the success of your project, the psychological cost of saying no in the present becomes unbearable. You are essentially using their own imagination to pre-frame the necessity of your solution. The master persuader knows that the first piece of information accepted as true becomes the anchor for everything that follows. This is why the pre-frame is more important than the presentation. By seeding a specific belief, even one as simple as, "This approach is unconventional but highly effective," you are installing a filter. The target will then spend the rest of the interaction looking for evidence that confirms this unconventional effectiveness while ignoring any signs of risk. You are not fighting for their attention. You are directing their attention so that they convince themselves. In the Sovereign OS system, this principle is activated through two main pathways: genetic/spatial kinship and synchronous action. Research has shown that using family language, such as brothers, homeland, and deep-rooted belonging at the right moment, unlocks the doors to the subconscious mind. When you address your audience in the audiobook empire as a knowledge family, you're not just using a metaphor, you're triggering ancient biological instincts that drive individuals to sacrifice and commit for the sake of the group. This framing makes any objection to your product seem like a betrayal of the tribe. Synchronization is key. When individuals participate in a unified activity, whether chanting a slogan, taking part in a digital challenge at the exact same moment, or even walking together, their individual identities merge into a collective identity. This synchronization acts as a trigger for absolute compliance. In the digital environment of 2026, you can engineer this through interactive live streaming that demands an instantaneous collective response, creating a sense of unity that makes rejecting the final offer psychologically impossible. This tactic is the practical essence of the principle of unity. When you ask for someone's opinion, you place them in a position of distance and criticism. But when you ask for their advice, you merge their identity with your own. The advisor feels responsible for the project's success because they have become part of its fabric. Before making your big pitch, ask the target for advice on a minor detail. This simple move is pre-framing that transforms them from a critic into a supportive partner. True sovereignty requires integrity. Using persuasion techniques to deceive people leads to a halo collapse in the long run. To sustain the growth of your empire, the promises you plant at the pivotal moment must match the value you ultimately deliver. Deception creates future resistance, while strategic honesty builds unwavering sovereign loyalty. You don't just want a sale. You're building an ecosystem where people trust your cues as much as they trust their instincts.
In the practice of persuasion, Cialdini identifies 3 distinct archetypes of influencers, and for the architect of a sovereign OS, understanding these is a matter of strategic survival. First, there are the bunglers of influence. These individuals are unaware of the persuasive triggers, or worse, they misuse them in ways that trigger psychological reactance. They miss the privileged moments entirely, attempting to persuade when the window is closed. Second, there are the smugglers of influence. These actors identify the triggers, like authority or scarcity, and smuggle them into situations where they don't naturally belong, for instance, creating a fake deadline or claiming expertise they do not possess.
While smugglers may achieve short-term gains, they are the primary cause of brand decay. Their influence is brittle and leads to the eventual collapse of the empire once the deception is unmasked. The third archetype is the sleuth of influence. The sleuth does not invent triggers, they uncover them. As a sovereign strategist in the 2026 digital grid, your role is to be a detective of the environment. You look for the genuine commonalities, the real expert insights, and the authentic scarcity that already exists within your proposal. By highlighting these pre-existing truths in the privileged moment, you achieve a level of influence that is both powerful and ethically sustainable. The sleuth's power comes from alignment, not fabrication. This ensures that the 1% margin you gain is cumulative, building a foundation of trust that makes future persuasion even more effortless. To scale the audiobook empire, we must move toward the automation of compliance. This involves the use of action-linked cues. By consistently pairing a specific visual or auditory signal with a state of high-value delivery, you are creating a Pavlovian response in your audience. Over time, the mere appearance of that signal acts as a persuasive anchor that puts the target in a state of readiness. This is how high-tier brands dominate the subconscious. They don't wait for the customer to decide. They trigger the decision state through environmental cues. The final phase of the process is ensuring that the yes survives the return of the analytical mind. This is achieved through persuasive reinforcement. Immediately after a commitment is made, you must provide the target with a logic-based justification that they can use to defend their decision to themselves and others. While the decision was made in the persuaded emotional state, it must be protected by a rational shell. This prevents buyer's remorse and ensures that the target remains a loyal node in your strategic network. You are providing them with the armor of logic to protect the territory you have captured in their mind. The master of the sovereign OS understands that persuasion is not merely an outward-facing weapon, it is an internal structural tool used to modulate the performance of the collective. To lead an elite team in the 2026 digital grid, you must curate their environment to prime specific cognitive states. For instance, research into environmental priming shows that the physical and visual cues in a workspace dictate the mode of the brain. If you require a team to engage in high-level creative problem-solving, the environment must be primed with expansive cues, high ceilings, views of the horizon, or images of open spaces. These cues subconsciously signal to the brain that it is safe to think beyond traditional boundaries. Conversely, when a task requires extreme precision, analytical rigor, and error checking, the environment should be contracted. Minimalist settings, structured layouts, and even specific lighting temperatures can act as persuasive anchors for focus. As a strategist, you must perform a sovereign audit of your team's digital and physical workspaces. Are the backgrounds of your video calls reinforcing your authority? Are the internal communication platforms primed with the identity signals of your empire? Every pixel and every plant is a silent directive. You are not just managing people, you are managing the sensory inputs that dictate their neural output. A common mistake in leadership is the always accessible trap. In the sovereign OS, accessibility is a persuasive resource to be deployed, not a default state. By strategically limiting access and creating a privileged moment for interaction, you ensure that when you do speak, your words are received with the weight of an elite transmission. This is scarcity applied to presence. You prime your team to value your input by ensuring it is not a background noise, but a focused, high-impact event. This creates a state of ready focus in your subordinates, ensuring that the implementation of your directives is immediate and precise. Finally, we must address the persuasion of the self. Before entering a high-stakes negotiation or a public broadcast, the sovereign influencer must prime their own mental state. This is achieved through identity anchoring, the use of specific rituals or environmental cues that reactivate your own sense of absolute competence and sovereign control. Whether it is a specific piece of music, a visual symbol of past victories, or a linguistic mantra, these anchors ensure that you enter the privileged moment as the dominant force in the room. You are not hoping for confidence, you are engineering it through the same persuasive mechanics you use on others. This internal alignment is the foundation of the 1% margin. In the traditional architecture of influence, the first 6 principles, reciprocity, liking, social proof, authority, scarcity, and consistency, operate on the basis of external triggers. However, the 7th principle, unity, operates on the level of identity. Unity is not about being like someone, it is about being of someone. It is the psychological state where the distinction between the I and the you is blurred into a collective we. For the master of the sovereign OS, triggering unity is the ultimate persuasive strike as it bypasses the entire analytical defense system. When a target perceives you as part of their core identity, be it through family, race, locality, or a deeply shared mission, the standard rules of evaluation are suspended. They no longer judge your proposal, they support it as if they were supporting themselves. The persuasive deployment of unity involves the strategic use of identity priming before the core message is delivered. In the 2026 digital landscape, this is achieved by using familial language and shared evolutionary cues. Research shows that simply using words like kinship, heritage, or legacy in the privileged moment can activate the primitive neural circuits associated with tribal protection. Once these circuits are active, the target becomes hyper-compliant to any request that is framed as being for the good of the group. In the audiobook empire, your subscribers are not customers, they are a knowledge tribe. By framing your strategic goals as a shared tribal mission, you ensure that their loyalty is rooted in their very sense of self. One of the most powerful ways to induce unity is through co-creation. When you invite a target to participate in the development of an idea, a product, or a strategy, you are not just gaining their input, you are fusing their identity with the outcome. This is the co-creation effect. A person who has contributed even a small amount of advice to a project is persuaded to value that project more highly than one they simply observed. In the sovereign OS, you must build tactical gaps into your presentations, allowing the target to fill them in. By doing so, they become psychological stakeholders. They cannot reject your final proposal without rejecting their own contribution. This is the ultimate defensive architecture, making the target's own ego your primary advocate. Unity is also forged through physical or digital synchrony. When people act in unison, whether it is through synchronized breathing, rhythmic chanting, or simultaneous digital interactions, their brains release oxytocin, the bonding hormone. This chemical shift creates a persuasive state of high trust and low skepticism. In the 2026 grid, this is executed through synchronized digital rituals, live events where thousands of users perform the same action at the same microsecond. This creates a powerful sense of being one, making the collective highly responsive to the sovereign leader's directives. You are not just leading a crowd, you are operating a single, multinodal organism that shares your vision and your pulse. In the pursuit of the 1% margin, the distinction between a smuggler and a sleuth is not merely moral, it is a matter of long-term structural stability. Persuasion is a high-voltage tool. If used to deliver a deceptive or hollow message, the resulting neural backlash will be catastrophic. In the 2026 digital grid, where information is transparent and reputations are quantified in real time, the cost of being caught in a manipulative frame is the total liquidation of your authority. Therefore, the sovereign OS dictates a policy of strategic integrity. You do not manufacture triggers, you curate reality. If you use a scarcity anchor, it must be based on a genuine limitation. If you use an authority anchor, it must be backed by verifiable competence. Research into the post-suasive environment shows that when people realize they have been moved by an artificial or dishonest trigger, they experience intense psychological reactance. They don't just regret the decision, they develop a permanent cognitive bias against the source.
To build an audiobook empire that stands the test of time, your persuasive strikes must lead to a high-value reality. When the target steps through the door you have opened, they must find exactly what you promised. This alignment creates a virtuous cycle of influence, where each successful interaction makes the next persuasive anchor even more potent. Trust becomes your most valuable pre-frame. A sovereign leader who appears too perfect is often viewed with suspicion. To bypass this, the master persuader uses the tactical admission. By acknowledging a minor flaw or a past mistake at the very beginning of a presentation, you are persuading the target to view you as exceptionally honest. This strategic vulnerability acts as a filter for everything that follows. The brain concludes that if you are willing to admit to a weakness, you must be telling the absolute truth about your strengths. This is particularly effective in high-stakes negotiations where the air is thick with skepticism. You are not just being authentic, you are engineering the perception of integrity to secure a larger victory.
Finally, you must be the guardian of your own cognitive environment. Just as you use persuasion on others, the world is constantly attempting to prime you. To maintain your 1% margin, you must practice neural hygiene. This involves the ability to spot the anchors and frames being deployed by competitors and market forces. By identifying the trigger, you neutralize its power over your own decision-making process. A sovereign actor is never primed by accident. They choose the frames through which they view the world. This level of self-mastery ensures that your audiobook empire is directed by a clear, unmanipulated strategic vision, allowing you to dominate the market from a position of absolute mental clarity. The journey through the mechanics of persuasion culminates in a single, unified truth. Influence is not a battle of arguments, but a mastery of environment. To operate at the level of the sovereign OS, you must cease to be a participant in the narratives of others and become the architect of your own psychological reality. The 1% margin is found in the seconds before the request is made. By synthesizing the principles of attention, association, and unity, you create a strategic event horizon from which no target can easily escape. You have learned that what is focal is perceived as causal, that metaphors are the assembly language of the mind, and that identity is the ultimate lock and key. A complete persuasive strike follows a precise clinical sequence. First, you capture the singular focus using the mystery approach or the Zeigarnik effect, rendering all competing stimuli invisible. Second, you deploy associative anchors, visuals, sounds, or linguistic motifs that link your objective to the target's existing positive concepts, authority, safety, or romance. Third, you trigger unity, moving the interaction from a negotiation between two parties to a shared mission of one collective identity. This sequence ensures that when the moment of choice arrives, the target feels they are not being persuaded by you, but are simply following their own internal logic. In the 2026 audiobook empire, this is the protocol for every launch, every negotiation, and every leadership directive. True sovereignty is not a transient state, it is a structural persistence. By installing implementation intentions and environmental refreshers, you ensure that your influence survives the decay of the privileged moment. You are building a system where the target's daily environment, their digital feeds, their workspace, and their internal self-talk acts as a continuous repriming engine. This is the 1% margin in its purest form, the cumulative advantage of being slightly more aligned, slightly more prepared, and slightly more invisible in your mechanics than any competitor. You are not just winning a market, you are defining the frequency at which that market operates. As we close this strategic archive, remember that the power of persuasion carries a heavy burden of responsibility. The sovereign strategist uses these tools to elevate, to lead, and to create value that justifies the psychological bypass. Your audiobook empire is the vehicle for this elevation. By mastering the invisible architecture of the mind, you ensure that the wisdom you curate reaches its destination without friction. You have the map, the tools, and the protocol. The privileged moment is now yours to command. Step into the arena not as a persuader, but as the designer of the inevitable. The 18,200-word foundation is laid. The rest is implementation.